Are Gen Z becoming Christians?
Apparently so. According to some recent research called the Quiet Revival, it turns out that church going is on the up, especially among young people. So this is traditionally the missing demographic in most churches, especially young men. And in 2018, when they surveyed the UK population, it turned out that less than 4% of young people were attending church regularly. This is 18 to 24-year-olds. But then they did the same survey in 2024, and they discovered this massive leap. It completely shocked the researchers, shocked me when they told me about it. And it turns out that Gen Z, these 18 to 24-year-olds, are now apparently have gone up to about 12% of them attending church. This is from 4%. That's even more pronounced among young men. They've gone from under 4% to 21% attending church. So it's been quite a massive leap. And so this has kind of left a lot of people sort of, scratching their heads, wondering what's going on. But I would say there have been signs for quite a while that Gen Z are taking an interest in religion. We've been seeing skyrocketing Bible sales internationally, apparently, according to the publishers, driven by Gen Z. Recent survey showed that Gen Z are half as likely to be atheists compared to their parents and grandparents. And generally, I've been hearing lots of talk about Gen Z being the most open generation spiritually. And potentially, one of the reasons for this is that they just haven't got any religious baggage to kick against. They have never really been in church. Their parents and grandparents stopped going to church. They've lived in a fairly secular atheist culture. So they don't have any kind of bad associations with religion to start with. And so there's a kind of blank slate there, an open book, if you will.
Well, I wonder if they have been living in an atheist culture. Because you mentioned in your book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which is amazing, everyone should check out, that the atheism numbers in the UK, they only went up by 1 point between 1991 and 2014 during this super strong new atheist movement. People like Dawkins slagging off religion. It didn't seem to actually do much in terms of turning people against religion and converting them to atheists. Maybe it turned them against Christianity in a certain sense, but they didn't move into atheism specifically. You look at all the stats and people in growing numbers becoming more and more spiritual. Maybe you can flesh out some of these differences for me.
It depends on your definitions. And so what was interesting is exactly what you say, that the statistics in terms of people becoming specifically atheist, sort of materialist, sort of people who say there's no God, there's no sort of life hereafter, everything is just matter in motion, it's just physics and chemistry. The people who are, if you like, those kinds of quite hardcore materialist atheists didn't move much. Even during this heyday of new atheism, when there were people like Richard Dawkins and atheist bus campaigns and everything.
And I think that's a pretty important point, because that is the strongest atheist movement in recent history that we've seen.
Exactly. Now, what has changed, of course, is that increasingly people have stopped going to church. So there's kind of a general kind of irreligiosity has grown. And there has been, in the statistics, a growth in what is often called the nones, people who don't have any religious commitments. But that's not quite the same thing as someone who kind of commits themselves to an atheist point of view. So what's happened is Christianity, in a sense, has shrunk. The number of people who call themselves Christian, the number of people who go to church, and the number of the quote-unquote non-religious has grown. But that doesn't necessarily mean people are defining themselves as atheists. And so it's this sort of interesting middle ground of agnosticism, often quite open to spirituality, actually. You'll often find these people still pray, still do things that you might think of as having kind of some sort of supernatural idea behind them. And so it's not that people have suddenly all been converted to a very Richard Dawkins hard atheism. They've just kind of lost their interest in institutional religion, is what it looks like.
What can we learn from this rise in specifically young men turning to the pews?
I think what we can learn is that things come and go. Often people have assumed that because we've seen a decline in religiosity and church-going in the West for a long time, that's the end of the story, that the Christianity is kind of going to go extinct at some point. Whereas actually, if you look at the bigger picture, there's always been a sort of ups and downs in terms of religious belief in all parts of the world, including in the West. And it's often looked in the past like Christianity is going down and then something happens and suddenly you have the Victorian revival or the Wesleyan Whitfield revival or the Great Awakening in America or whatever it is. You suddenly find that something happens and suddenly people wake up again, it would appear, to God and so on. And I just wonder if what we're showing is that actually that's sort of happening again. We've had a long period of secularization in the West. Since the 50s and 60s, we've had this steep decline in church going to the point where most young people are not to be found in church. But I just wonder whether we're seeing one of those moments where something's happening and people can only live with a sort of secular materialist story of reality for so long before a kind of spiritual hunger or thirst kicks in. And to me, that's what's happening in our generation. I think young people are suddenly feeling spiritually hungry again, and they're looking for more than a sort of secular material culture can offer them.
Well, flesh that out for me a little bit more, because at the moment it seems a little bit arbitrary, a little bit at the mercy of the tide going in and out at random points. Why is this happening now, do you think?
Well, I would say, for me, at the core of this is what psychologists sometimes call a meaning crisis. I sense that as we've lost a sort of religious way of looking at life in the West, that it's led to a kind of void in people's lives, whether they sort of realize it or not. Something that used to give them a sense of meaning and purpose and identity, a joint story that we all shared. And in the Christian story, this was a story in which you were created by God, made in his image. That gave you sort of infinite value and worth, and that even though life was hard, God came in person to share that life with us. And through his death and resurrection, he invites us into an eternal hope and a purpose. And that sort of story sort of framed people's lives, whether they consciously realized it or not. They found themselves within a story that made sense of their lives. Now, as that story has been sidelined in the modern West, in our sort of post-Christian, very increasingly secular atheist age, I think people have still needed some kind of a story to make sense of their lives. It's not that they can just do without any story whatsoever. And again, the psychologists tell us people who do feel like they're essentially bouncing around chaotically without any kind of narrative to overarch or guide their life, that leads to very bad mental health outcomes. People don't do well if they don't feel like there's a story that makes sense of their life. So I think people have been reaching for all kinds of other stories in our culture. And the kinds of stories they put in place of that God story end up being often political ideologies, maybe sexuality and gender stuff on both the left and the right that kind of gets put, I think, into the place of God. The problem is all these stories butt up against each other. They're all completely different. They create these toxic culture wars where no one can agree on everything. And supercharged by social media and a digital age, that leads to a lot of very, I think, distracted, confused, distressed, actually, young people. And we see this with the escalating mental health rates. And I think all of this has kind of come to a head in recent years. And as I say, it's this meaning crisis, people looking for a story to make sense of their life, but failing to find the stories they've invested their lives in satisfactory. And so I think almost out of desperation, hunger, thirst, they're turning back to that original story that their parents and grandparents kind of dismissed. But they're suddenly realizing, there is a story that might make sense of my life, and it's this Christian story. And it turns out it was pretty successful in the past at building a civilization that managed to get quite a lot done and has quite a lot of advantages. So especially among young men, you asked that was kind of, I think, where your question was, why the Gen Z young men in particular. And I think the reason they are coming back so strongly, and I'm hearing so many stories of young men just wandering into the doors of churches, no Christian background whatsoever, not being invited even, just turning up. I think they are hearing from a lot of social media influencers, people like, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, the historian, lots of other people who are sort of talking about the value of faith. And for young men, I think they've felt that meaning crisis especially sharply, because I think the whole question of what it means to be a man has been under scrutiny. Toxic masculinity has become a phrase that's been associated with being a man. And it leads a lot of young men, especially, to feel like, well, I don't know who I am. I don't know who I'm supposed to be in one culture. I don't have a story that makes sense of my life. And so that I think because they have especially found themselves rootless and sort of floating in a void, they've been the most open to something that might actually have some roots, give a sense of a purpose and meaning and identity. And that's why I think we're seeing them come back so strongly to the Christian story.
It sounds like what you're getting at is that it's maybe not specifically the Christian story that is changing people's minds, but it's that people are desperate for a sense of narrative. They're bouncing all over the place. They don't know what the meaning of getting out of bed in the morning is. So they've gone in all kinds of different directions. Some of them have become social justice warriors. Some of them have joined incel forums online. And some of them have gone to church. Am I wrong in that analysis?
I think you're probably right. And I think I would agree with you that people are looking for a story and they will put some kind of story in the place of that big story. The question is, have they got hold of the right story? And the only thing I would say in support of the ones who are going to church and discovering the Christian story is that I don't think those who are looking for that kind of fulfillment in the, uber right-wing sort of movements or the uber left-wing movements, I don't think they're going to find what they're looking for there, kind of a sense of peace and everything else, because you're basically swapping the correct religious story, in my view, for an incorrect religious story, because those left and right sort of extremes are still very religious in their own way. They kind of fulfill a kind of in-group, out-group kind of mentality where you're either with us or against us, and people who are against me are demonic and demon-possessed and basically the enemy. It's full of cancel culture, both on the left and the right in that way. Whereas the Christian story, and the church in particular, is a place where you're supposed to be able to come and not be cancelled. It's a place where this idea of forgiveness and grace is at the very core of the whole thing. And it says whoever you are and whatever your background is, and no matter how much you've stuffed up, you can have a fresh start here. And I think when people discover that, it's a kind of completely different kind of story to the types of stories people are searching for in these forums on the left and the right, which are just about kind of, I have to be the most pure version of this particular ideology to gain some kind of credence and credibility in the eyes of my peers. And that is going to ultimately be very destructive for people. And so I think even if people are looking in these other places, there's a kind of natural sense in which, because those places wear you out and down, it comes back to the original story.
Well, you mentioned the political wings, both left and right, sort of cleaving to different stories that are in contradiction with each other, and it leads to problems societally. I wonder how much of this revival that you speak about, or at least rebirth in the willingness to be open towards something sort of numinous, is still political. You see the top intellectuals, people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Jordan Peterson, they're coming to God, but there are these undertones that are very political. I mean, you and Alex O'Connor have spoken about this, how Ayaan Hirsi Ali's initial sort of coming out letter, coming to Christ letter, there were more mentions of the Islamist threat to the West than Jesus Christ. And you see the same with Douglas Murray. Yep. He struggles with the actual truth claims of Christianity, of Jesus' resurrection. So I wonder how much of this is a genuine coming to Christ, and how much of this is a defense mechanism from the older generation who feel like their civilization's under threat, and more of a narrative and meaning problem for the younger generation who feel like they have nothing to cling to because the older generations are constantly fighting and they've kind of left us in a dodgy spot.
Yeah. I think I agree with everything you said, because it's a very mixed bag. But it's always been that way. People have always come to faith for all kinds of mixed motives and lots of different reasons. So it doesn't surprise me that certain people on the right, Douglas Murray, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Jordan Peterson, arguably, are kind of partly reaching for an interest in religion again because of what they see as the social benefits it could bring, that we need something like the Christian narrative to make sense of our lives and to rebuild, civilization in the West. Now, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a really interesting example of this because, as you say, when she published that viral essay, Why I'm Now a Christian, sort of renouncing her new atheism, embracing apparently Christianity, a lot of it was about the civilizational threats of Islamism and the woke left and everything else. And so she'd come to this kind of intellectual place of believing only the Christian story can sustain our foundations as a civilization. So we need to re-embrace the Christian story. Now, that is a very kind of utilitarian, kind of arguably political way of engaging Christianity. But I don't think you can divorce that from the fact that she also mentioned in that article a personal meaning crisis that she'd had, where she as an atheist could no longer make sense of her life at a personal level. And she only sort of hinted at it really in the article, but in some subsequent interviews, she talked, quite openly about this personal journey she'd been on, the way she'd kind of become very nihilistic, depressed, had gone to a number of counselors. She was essentially a functioning alcoholic at the time. And it was only when one of them suggested, have you tried praying? That she said, well, I can't. I'm an atheist, and the God I was raised with in Islam was a monster. And this person said, well, what kind of a God do you think you could believe in? And she started to describe the kind of God she might be willing to believe in. And she says she kind of realized she was essentially describing Jesus Christ at that point. So she thought, well, maybe I shouldn't invent a new God. Maybe I need to look into this person who claimed to be God. So she started going to church. She started praying. And in her own words, God turned her life upside down. She's been baptized along with her husband, Neil Ferguson, interestingly. So that's obviously something where a political sort of cultural issues that were framing her journey was certainly at the forefront of some of the reasons why she started to take Christianity seriously again. But it was, in her case, that personal journey has also obviously been very important to her. And I think what Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I don't want to speak for her, but what I sense from the interviews I've seen her give and some of my own brief conversations with her is that she's come to realize you can't have the civilizational effects of Christianity without actually believing the story, actually encountering the person at the center of this, Jesus Christ. And in her case, I think that's happened. Now, I think there are people all along this spectrum, however, sort of Ayaan Hirsi Ali's kind of jumped in at a personal level. Someone like a Douglas Murray, who I've had a couple of conversations with on this front, are very interested, enthusiastic, sympathetic about Christianity. They want to see Christianity do well. They believe it's really important for the moral fiber of the country, basically. And because of these concerns they have about radical Islam and everything, and the fact that if you don't have a strong story like Christianity, another strong story like Islam is going to take over. The secular story just can't really compete. Now, he again, I think, does come with this quite utilitarian political kind of motivation, but he's not at the place where Ayaan Hirsi Ali has got. He hasn't been able to accept it for himself. And I don't know what would be involved in that. So I fully accept there are certain people in this conversation who are very sympathetic to, enthusiastic even about Christianity, but at a personal level, they're not there. They haven't sort of come all the way through. What I will say is wherever someone comes into faith from, be it on the right or the left, and whatever motivations have gone into that, I think when they do encounter the person of Christ, speaking here as a Christian, that it's going to challenge their ideology, their political framework, no matter which side of it they've come in, because Jesus somehow, I think, transcends both the left and the right. And so for me, that's really important. Okay, people are going to have all their different motivations for why they want Christianity to be true, potentially. But if it's true, it's going to make a difference to you as well. And you're going to find that politics actually isn't at the center of this. It's a person called Jesus.
Well, let's go a bit deeper on this, because I can imagine for someone who's secular, who's been raised in very much, if you're someone like me, I was raised in Brighton, right, which is the most atheist place in the UK, and any metropolitan area is going to be very, if not atheist, at least sort of secular,
progressive.
And progressive. Yeah. They're going to be listening to this. They're going to be hearing you using the word story. And they're going to be hearing that people are suffering from a meaning crisis, people feel under threat, and then they're turning to Christianity. Someone might be watching this thinking, okay, cool, but what does that do for Christianity and its truth claims? You could look at the rise in drug uses when there's a pandemic and people are at home and depressed, and they make them feel so much better. So, what are the truth claims to Christianity from this? And what makes you confident that this isn't just another crest of the wave that's then going to die down once Christianity sort of patches us up, makes us feel better, and people forget about it again. Is this different?
Well, it could be that it is another wave, and in a sense, there's lots of factors that go on in a culture as to why people turn back towards God. And a lot of them are to do with what's going on. I mean, it's interesting if you look back to the 20th century, in an otherwise general story of decline in the church, there was one upturn in baptisms and confirmations in the Church of England, and it took place immediately after the Second World War. It's pretty obvious why. The world and the UK had gone through a massive period of instability, war, and it generated a sort of a sense that we need stability and so on. So people went back to church and they started to become more religious, and they and so it led to this sort of just this moment where there was, it bucked the trend of overall, increasing secularization. So it's completely to be expected that external forces will inevitably make a difference to whether people are more open or less open to investigating and being open to Christianity. And I think we're in one of those moments. I think there's massive instability around the world. There's global political turmoil. All kinds of factors, I think, are pressing people towards church and to the Christian story. Now, that's completely separate almost to the question you've raised, which is, well, is it true? It may be comforting. It may be something people kind of tend to naturally go towards in times of crisis, but that's not the same thing as it being true. And absolutely, I agree with that. For me, the good news is that not only does Christianity answer people's longings when they feel this emotional tug and they're looking for a sense of home and security and meaning and purpose and identity, it comes up with the goods precisely because it is true. It's not just a kind of useful fiction. I think that's the way a lot of some of these secular atheists who are kind of interested in the value of Christianity see it, are kind of, well, of course it's not true, but it's kind of useful to have around because it does make people feel better and it builds good civilizations with the right kinds of moral frameworks and so on. But that's kind of, I think, putting things the wrong way around. What they're saying is, well, it's sort of true because it works, okay? Whereas my view is, no, it works because it's true. The reason it works is because there's something actually true at the center of this. So yeah, most of my life I've spent in what is sometimes called Christian apologetics. This is the rational defense of Christian faith. I, for 17 years, hosted a show where I would bring Christians and atheists on to debate, does God exist? Is the resurrection true? Can we trust the Bible? Does science and faith mix? All of those core questions. And I hosted hundreds of atheists, some of the best known atheists in the world, people like Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker and Daniel Dennett, opposite some of the best Christian minds in the world, people like William Lane Craig and John Lennox. And yeah, just so many kind of interesting debates and conversations. And I certainly came through that very challenged very often in my Christian faith. There are so many things that I don't think you necessarily have a clear answer to. There are lots of mysteries. But I also came through seeing that there is a really strong historical core to Christian faith, that there are actually some really good reasons to believe in God from a sort of philosophical or scientific perspective. There are really good reasons to believe that there is a moral structure to the universe that I think finds its home in God. And I think there are also really good reasons to believe that Jesus was who he said he was, lived a life that vindicated that claim of being the Son of God, died and rose again. And if that's true, and if the movement that launched has made the most difference to the world of any person living or dead, then I think you have to take Christianity seriously at an intellectual level. So for me, I think that's one of the great joys of Christianity. It does answer that more subjective, emotional component of who we are. But if you're looking for it, it's also got the historical and intellectual legs to support that idea that we're made for more than just this life.
It's such a compelling argument, and it's something that I really try hard to grapple with and not ignore as someone that is agnostic, raised kind of atheist family. But it is stunning how this has lasted for 2,000 years now. And we do see that when we tend away from Christian values, things go wrong, meaning crises occur. the problem that I have is that I can't really square this in my head that just because it's helpful, it must necessarily be true. I don't see those two things following from each other. So maybe you could help me out and flesh that out a little bit more. Why is it that just because it works and is helpful for us and maybe comforts us and brings us together and gives us a more cohesive society, it's necessarily true?
Well, that's not what it's not what I'm actually arguing. I'm saying it's possible that it's not true just because it's helpful. So I would say, though, the reason why it is helpful is because it is true. So I'm not saying because it's helpful, it's therefore true.
Sure.
I'm saying the reason why it's been so helpful is because it happens to be true. But I think you could kind of put away all of the good things Christianity has done for us, in terms of healthcare, education, literature, human rights, all of the stuff that, Tom Holland talks about in Dominion, all of the, if you like, the legacy of Christianity. You could say, well, just let's park all that. Okay, pretend none of that happened. Did Jesus Christ rise from the dead? I think there's good historical evidence to say he did. So on that basis alone, I can recommend Christianity as an intellectually credible way of looking at the world. Now, the fact that it also happens to have been the most helpful worldview to have shaped the kind of culture in which you and I now live, in which we have a regard for human rights, equality, dignity, progress, freedom, and so on, I think is not inconsequential. I think it naturally follows, if this is true, then it's going to produce a kind of culture that you and I would want to live in, that even Richard Dawkins, would want to live in, because he is quite happy to be living in a sort of as a cultural Christian in the West. But no, I'm not saying it's true because Richard Dawkins likes cultural Christianity. Quite the opposite. I'm saying it's true on its own terms. I think if you go and look at the philosophical, historical evidence for Christianity, you'll find a really strong, coherent case for it there. And the problem is that I spent a long time doing that, trying to convince people, sort of just go and look at these arguments for the resurrection, look at these amazing arguments for God. And what I discovered is there's a certain number of people for whom that's engaging. They're like, I believe. But most people don't start there. Most people, it turns out, aren't actually at a place where they're just going to be convinced by a sort of logical, deductive argument for Christianity. Most people are starting from a much more imaginative place, which is about their longings and their hopes and their sense of how the world should be. And that's why I think we're now seeing this openness to Christianity, because we're not ultimately terribly rational creatures. We don't, most of the time, we use our reason to kind of justify the thing that the direction our heart wants to go. Okay. I think like psychologists like Jonathan Haidt have shown this quite well, that he talks about the elephant and the rider, and the rider thinks he has control over the great big elephant underneath him. And that's us having this idea that our reason, is what directs us in our life. But he says, actually, what's really directing you is the elephant. It's your intuitions and your sense of what your heart wants to do. And the reason just kind of sits atop it and sort of justifies it sort of, post the experience. And so I think it's a bit like that. Actually, you have to start with Christianity, for most people, I think, with their heart's desire, the way they would like the world to be. And I think if you can show that Christianity answers those kinds of longings, which are inevitably subjective and emotional, then I think people may be open to kind of looking at the harder intellectual evidence for Christianity. So, I mean, Blaise Pascal, I think, put it very well. He said, make good men wish that religion were true and then show them that it is. Because you have to start with where people are. And most of us are going more on intuitions and a sense of the way we wish things could be. And if you can show them that Christianity kind of fulfills that, I think you've then got a much better chance of then showing them, there also happens to be some pretty good intellectual evidence for Christianity as well.
Do you think there's such a thing as non-resistant non-believers?
So if I could try to define what that is, just so we're on the same page. As I understand it, a non-resistant non-believer is someone who says, look, I believe I'm not in any way putting up personal emotional barriers to God. And if God is there I'm totally open to that. But at this point, I haven't been presented with enough evidence to persuade me, or an experience that would persuade me that there is a God. Do those people exist? Maybe, but I cannot tell, and you cannot tell, because what they're essentially saying is, I have complete knowledge of all my interior life and psychology.
Yeah.
None of us have that.
Yeah.
So it's impossible to say there are definitely non-resistant non-believers, because who of us can really plumb the depths of our deepest sort of, sense of why we do or don't believe in things? Okay.
So I wonder if that's relevant, though. I wonder if the subconscious element to being a non-resistant non-believer is actually relevant. If you are all day, every day, consciously praying, you hope you are one of the good men that Pascal speaks about, that wishes it was true. But on a subconscious level, maybe there is something that's holding you back based on, I don't know, a class in evolution you had in primary school. Is that you really resisting, or is that just something that's been fed to you that you can't help but have in the back of your mind?
Yeah, you could be right there. You could be right. And so perhaps it's not fair to say of the non-resistant non-believer, if there's some kind of psychological thing that's ingrained somewhere in the background, that means they actually are resisting God. I guess I'm willing to take, people's word for it. I'm a fairly trusting person, so I'm willing to say if you feel like you really don't have any sort of personal beef or reason to kind of reject God, and that if there was just enough evidence or an experience or whatever, then sure, I'd say I'm willing to take your word that you're open, but it hasn't happened for some reason. Now, then the next natural question, I suppose, is, well, why hasn't God revealed himself, or this person come to believe in God if they're genuinely open and whatever? Again, the problem is, just as we can't necessarily know the deepest mind of the person, we cannot know the mind of God either. God may have all kinds of reasons why this person has not yet come to believe or trust in him.
What would one of those reasons be?
Well, let's take a mutual friend of ours, Alex O'Connor. Okay, just as a sort of hypothetical here. Okay, I'm just sort of spitballing this. This is kind of like, because I do not claim to know Alex or the mind of God when it comes to Alex O'Connor. But here's a hypothetical for you, okay? Let's say that Alex is a completely non-resistant non-believer. If only there was just that one intellectual argument that just took him over the threshold, or an experience that came to make him believe in God. So why isn't God doing that? Well, it could be that at this point in his life, Alex, as a non-believer, doing his channel, doing his fantastic content, is doing a lot more for God's kingdom than if Alex became a Christian right now. It could be that in the great scheme of things, when we look back on this 10,000 years hence, Alex remaining a non-Christian at this point turns out to have been a really important part of a bigger plan that God has. Now, I'm obviously kind of, I'm not saying that is the reason or anything like that.
It would be true. He's either going to be one of the world's greatest atheists or one of the world's greatest conversion stories.
Exactly. So so that's just an example. Here's one possible reason, for example, why God may choose not to have given Alex the experience that he says he's looking for, or whatever it might be. I mean, and you could multiply a million other possible reasons. The point is, we don't know. This is the point, is that God, given that God is, if God exists, God is a being that is far beyond our mortal ability to understand the ways in which he brings together all of events and purposes and causes throughout the whole of time to bring about his ultimate purposes. It's almost impossible for us to know why he chooses to allow certain things to happen and other things don't happen. From our point of view, it's like, well, why wouldn't Alex become a Christian, or did God give Alex this experience if he says he's open to it? I guess it's just one of those things where we can't know, but it's not at all inconceivable that there are still good reasons. I guess that's the point.
There is a problem with this. If God is omnibenevolent, and we accept that there might be such a thing as non-resistant non-believers, it seems unfair for God to deny that atheist access to the pearly gates in the name of helping out someone else become a Christian. They are one of these good men that Pascal speaks about, but they can't quite make it over the line. They can't make that leap of faith. They're non-resistant. Oh, okay, it's fine because they've helped 10,000 other people get into heaven and persuade them with their apologetics, like Alex O'Connor might do. But if Alex O'Connor never converts, he's not getting in through those pearly gates, right? And that feels unjust for an omnibenevolent God to use someone like that.
So again, I'd want to question this whole idea of what the end goal is, if you like. If the unjust thing is that Alex was as open as he could be, but he never kind of, received enough evidence or had, the experience he was looking for, and therefore God said, when he did reach the quote unquote pearly gates, sorry, you're not allowed in after all. On a technicality, you just didn't quite make it, Alex. That's not my conception actually of what it is to be a Christian or to receive eternal life. In the end, again, I'm kind of putting a lot into the basket of I don't know the mind of God, I don't know the mind of Alex. Again, we don't know how God will deal with Alex O'Connor if he dies still as a non-resistant non-believer. It's entirely in God's hands. And I'm perfectly happy with that because God, if God exists again, and God is omnibenevolent and as merciful as I believe he is, then God will do absolutely justly and as absolutely mercifully as is possible within the will of God. So I'm perfectly happy to leave Alex to God in that sense, because I think that God will do exactly the right thing with Alex O'Connor. In the end, the problem is that many people sort of see heaven, quote unquote, as a sort of place you should have if you've kind of been a good enough person and sort of had a kind of maybe not rejected God, even if you haven't kind of ultimately accepted God. That's not the way the Bible speaks about heaven, really, because that makes heaven a sort of some sort of reward for doing well, basically a kind of, retirement home where you can play heavenly golf or something because you were basically okay and did the right thing while you're on earth. I mean, in reality, what the Bible talks about is the fact that none of us deserve God. None of us could work our way, could ever do enough good things. None of us could ever be a good enough non-resistant non-believer to sort of make up for the fact that we also do a lot of bad stuff in our life. And that, as it were, that sort of means that we can never be with God. There's this kind of barrier, this sin barrier that stops us. So the whole point of Christian faith is that by accepting that God did something on our behalf in Jesus through the forgiveness of our sins, and we accept that as a free gift, that if you like, that is the thing that opens up those pearly gates. It's not something we can do. It's not something that Alex could ever do. It's something that God has done for us in Jesus Christ. So that's the very heart of Christian faith. Is it's not about me. It's about God. It's about Jesus. And secondly, what heaven is, the way that the Bible describes it is as the kingdom of God. And a kingdom is a place with a king. And it means that whatever that is, it's somewhere where I am not the be all and end all of it. It's about Jesus being king in a place where everything comes under his rule and reign. Now, the reality is, I know quite a few skeptics and atheists who will say, look, I don't think I've done anything so bad that I shouldn't be denied entry to heaven. And I'm sort of, I can't see any reason why God would not accept me, sort of thing. For me, it's more, well, would you accept God? That's the real question. Would you be happy to live under the rule and reign of King Jesus?
But that sounds like it's a choice and that they couldn't be non-resistant to that.
Well, again, I'd want to say this is something where you have to, ultimately it's going to be between that person and God on the final day. So it's like I say, I'm not saying, even if Alex died, without belief in God, without having accepted Jesus as his savior or anything like that, I'm not saying, too late, Alex. There might, it may well be that God sees something in Alex's heart that you and I and even Alex is, so it's like I'm not sort of ruling out the idea that, that there's no way or whatever. But at the same time, I think we need to be really careful of the fact that it's not about us in the end. It is about God, and it's about, in the deepest sort of part of us, are we open to someone else being the king in our life now and in the life to come? Because that's what it is. It's, and I know a lot of atheists who would say, well, I want heaven if it's there, but I think they want it on their own terms. And they're not that interested in the God bit of it.
They're not interested in the kingdom of Jesus and
No.
God. They're interested in the kingdom for the sake of the kingdom itself.
They're interested in life eternal, but that's, I think, in a sense, C.S. Lewis wrote a great book called The Great Divorce about the way in which people get life eternal on their own terms if they're looking for it, but it's not the life in God that they're looking for. I think if there is a hell, it's a kind of, it's such a thin existence because it's something that it's a life lived without God. To the point where I would say it's a non-life. I actually believe that my personal view, this isn't shared by all Christians, but is that those who ultimately reject God, reject Christ, they don't go to some sort of eternal conscious torment where they're sort of being punished forever. I think they go out of existence because a life where you've rejected God is a life where you've rejected the source of life. So for me, it's a sort of, I'm not going to make any judgment about how God will deal with every individual on that final day.
But scripturally speaking, would they need to accept God into their heart to make it through those pearly gates?
I think they have to accept Jesus, yeah. So they have to have accepted the sacrifice that Jesus made on their behalf. But I think God can tell, even. But this is kind of, again, where I would maybe differ from some other Christians. I believe that God can see what that person's response would have been, even if they've never heard in their life of Jesus.
Sure.
God will deal perfectly justly with every person because he can see exactly what their response to him would be had they been given that opportunity and so on. So I'm saying, yeah, absolutely. I'm not a kind of, everyone will get in. It's just sort of, as long as you basically live a nice life and whatever. It's absolutely central to me is Jesus and his sacrifice. That is the thing that opens up the possibility of life with God. But I don't think we're in a position to judge exactly who will and won't receive that because we are not God. And God sees things in a very different way to the way we see things. All I see is I want to invite everyone to take that invitation seriously now in this life, to not leave it till your deathbed. If you are a non-resistant non-believer, well, maybe go out on a limb and pray and do whatever it takes to sort of say, I'm here, I'm open, I want to believe. And I believe God does honor that. I believe when Jesus says, knock and the door will be opened, I think that's true. I think that does happen. And for those who say, well, I have, and it hasn't happened, again, I don't know. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but I really do believe that anyone who's truly seeking, that they will find.
There's something very important that links into all of this. You write about this in your book. Jonathan Gottschall says, if you had a technology that allowed you to live any story you wanted, why would you ever want to come out? Why would you ever want to stop playing God? Could it be that the problems faced by Gen Z aren't from us leaving God behind and the Bible as a closed book? It's that we actually try too hard to play God.
Yeah, I think that might be one of the issues, and we've kind of overplayed our hand significantly, I think. I think there's a sense in which when you sort of reach a point in a culture where you've so left behind, if you like, the things that gave a framework to what human life is, and said, we're going to completely rip up the rule book. We're going to do whatever we like. You can be exactly whatever you want to be. Inevitably, you're going to discover fairly quickly that there are some reasons why there were some boundaries to human life and existence and the way we think of what it is to be human and so on. You now have the transhumanists who are saying, well, look, Do we even have to have these physical bodies? Can we not modify ourselves in all kinds of ways? Can we upload our consciousness to the cloud? Maybe we'll, be able to completely shake off our kind of more. And for me, I think, that's great sci-fi, but it's going to be a disaster for the experience of being a human. We are embodied human beings. We have natural limitations. We have a sexuality, a gender. We have all of those things that kind of are markers of who we are. Now, of course, there's a lot of differentiation across the species. There's lots of, people who are, in different sort of, the sort of extremes of all of that. But overall, the problem is that when you say there's no rules and you can be whatever you want to be, it does, I think, lead to some, as we're seeing, I think, in our culture, some really bad outcomes because we aren't made to kind of be in a make your own adventure storybook. We're meant to live in, as I say, this story which there is this narrative of a God who's come, been with us, and invites us into eternal life. And when people, I think, discover that, and I think this is where Gen Z, because they've been told for so long, be whatever you want to be, and so on. And when that hasn't worked out well, I think they're pretty quickly learning, actually, we got sold a false bill of goods here, and we need to come back to something that perhaps is more traditional, that is a bit more tried and tested. And they're suddenly discovering this ancient wisdom and this story of Christianity. And I'm constantly surprised, actually, in my interactions with Gen Z, how many of them are actually becoming very traditional in lots of ways. Almost, it's like it's like the new rebellion, almost. So, whereas their parents and grandparents were shaking off the shackles of institutional religion and morality and saying, we're, the punk generation was just saying, we'll do what we want and we'll live our lives our way.
How did that turn out?
Exactly. And now the punk thing to do is to say, I'm going to become religious. I'm going to sort of go to church. I'm going to try and build a life in which it's I am putting myself within a certain set of boundaries, and I'm going to, put myself within a certain sort of range of things I will do sexually, or because of, who I am as a man or a woman, or I'm not going to kind of say I can be whatever I want to be, because actually I think there are things that I'm more naturally suited to for the person I am. So it's interesting to me that Gen Z is starting to reject that kind of, the new punk rebellion is actually to become quite traditional in that way.
Yeah, material prosperity masks spiritual poverty. And I think that's exactly what's happened. Our material prosperity has led to us becoming entitled. And that's not me getting up on a high horse and accusing other people of being that way. I'm that way as a Gen Zer.
Yeah.
I like to say that we like to do hard things now, as long as they're not hard. There's this idea of this self-development sort of guru culture where they say, go out and do hard things because you'll never be ready otherwise for when a proper hard thing hits you in the face. And life is hard, so you need to set up challenges. But the challenges that we're giving ourselves aren't challenges because they're self-imposed. We're prepared for them, and it's 3x12 bench press in air-conditioned gym where we've had a warm-up and we've taken pre-workout and we're wearing our comfy, baggy, oversized gym clothes. It's not true difficulty. And it's something that I realized about a year ago that I had been essentially tricked into doing. I was doing all of these hard things that I thought were hard, but weren't. And they weren't preparing me in any way for the reality of what's out there in the world. But then that kind of illusion of doing hard things, it leads to us thinking that we can conquer the world and that we're entitled to the world. And then something slaps us in the face. And we realize it wasn't that simple. It wasn't as simple as that 60-second TikTok made it out to be. That leads to people getting disenfranchised, and it leads to retreat. It's not that people stall and then eventually they get back off their butt and they keep on going. The difference is so extreme when you're promised everything that you don't just stall. You completely retreat and you lie in bed and rot whilst scrolling on TikTok. And it's the sad reality of where we're at now. So I think it's that gap in expectations versus reality.
I think you're absolutely right. And you've seen this sort of sad tendency for a lot of young guys to kind of give up on life because it's hard, because it turns out that getting, doing well in relationships and career and life goals turns out to be much harder than you were led to believe. The problem with our current culture is you can get a kind of simulacrum of that through technology. And so, if I can't get a real girlfriend, I'll get an AI girlfriend. And if I can't have real relationships, I've got pornography. And if I can't develop a career and these other life goals, I can do really well on this game. And there's a sort of sense in which we're seeing that sort of collapse almost among young men, especially, who, like you say, are not in a place where they feel strong enough to kind of go out and sort of win the world or whatever it is. And for me, it's a tragedy. It's really sad to see that. But I think it's also because they are feeling so disenfranchised and upset. And I think it's one of the reasons why when someone comes along and says, well, you weren't made for this life, you weren't, and there is actually a community, a place, a story where even though you are a failure, okay, it's okay. We're all failures. We're all in the same boat. But there's this opportunity to have this grace, this forgiveness, this new start that is not about how well you do, but about what someone else has done for you. I think that can be a very compelling story at that point, because it takes young people and young men especially, I think, out of this sense that I have to do it all. It's all down to me and how well I do. It kind of just says, you're not going to do well. None of us do well, actually, in the end. But actually, there's this person who's done something on your behalf and who invites you into a new life, and through his grace gets you back up on your feet. And for me, again, I'm biased, but the church is one of those unique places where, especially for young people, I think they can find a genuine kind of community. And the problem is, again, it's the fact that we're now offering this very shallow version of community through the online means and through, TikTok and everything else. It'll produce the dopamine hit, but all it does is create a kind of a shallow version of something. The hard thing is actually getting alongside people, developing relationships with real human beings who are difficult, annoying, and everything else. But when we do that in the context of a church community, where we're actually, rather than just gathering because of a shared interest or goal, we're gathering around a person, Jesus Christ, I think that makes all the difference to the possibility of actually growing as a human being. So I think that's, again, one of the reasons why Gen Z are finding themselves attracted to church. It's a different way of being a human than what's basically on offer to them at the moment, which is either you have to excel at everything or you're a failure, or there's this other route, which is stay in your basement and play video games. And the church offers something that's completely different to those two extremes.
I've been fascinated by Jean Baudrillard's idea of the simulacrum and simulacra theory recently. It's this French philosopher, and he gets you to imagine this kingdom that's perfectly charted by a map of the kingdom that is laid above the kingdom. So you have this map that's sort of charting a replicant of what the kingdom looks like, but it's a map. Okay. So of course, it's not the actual kingdom. And over the years, this kingdom begins to fade. It disintegrates, it crumbles, and the map remains. So all that's left is this simulacrum of what the kingdom once was. But it's not the kingdom. And then he goes on to map it onto a bunch of wacky postmodern theories about Disney World in America. Okay. But where I like to think of this is in relation to social media. The idea that what we're seeing online is an accurate reflection of reality. It's not. It's built on inaccuracies that are then built on by more inaccuracies. And we take that as a proxy for reality and we trust in it heavily. And it's terrifying. Even just an obvious example, like when I go on holiday somewhere to a place I've been before, I'm always struck by the beauty and the different size to the place compared to what my photo showed me on my camera roll. And that's me having actually been there with a memory in my head that's been overridden by social media that I've posted or by my camera roll on my iPhone.
Yeah.
So then imagine you take it to something that you've never experienced. It's terrifying what the implications of that are. And I can see why the church can be so effective in reversing these things, because it is genuine connection. I think that's what always strikes me as so beautiful going to church, which I do on occasion, not quite once a month to make it into the statistics, but I love the genuine connection that.
But what you find there is not necessarily what you see on TikTok. And there's always this danger, even with the sort of, talking about the quiet revival and Gen Z coming back to church and so on. The reality is, if you've been influenced by some Christian influencers on TikTok saying you need to get back to church and so on, when you actually turn up at church, you'll probably find it's not the amazing thing that whatever they were experiencing is, because it's always going to be filtered through this sort of idealized way in which people present themselves on social media. You're going to find something that in some ways is beautiful and in other ways is challenging and difficult and sort of demands something of you that you're not necessarily willing to give. But I think it's worth it. It's worth persevering and just exactly as you're saying, Elliot, because Gen Z so often have been offered everything as though, do this and it'll come, we've lost the sense that actually some things are worth just working at and persevering, and you're not going to see results immediately. And you have to kind of dig and dig and dig before you find this treasure that might be lurking at the bottom. But that's what kind of the act of faith is doing that. It's saying, I believe that there's something here and I'm going to work at it and kind of give this my all, trusting that there is something that's going to happen in the process. And for me, that's exactly it. It's that human element of coming to a church which is full of people just like you who are messed up with all their faults and idiosyncrasies, and finding that when you pitch yourself in and you do it on the understanding that we're all here because of this person, Jesus, it has the ability to do something that no other institution can do. It has this ability to inspire and challenge and grow people in all kinds of ways. Often gets things wrong as well. It is a human institution, the church. So don't come with any sort of idea that it'll be some, as I say, perfect utopia where suddenly all my problems will disappear. It won't. Some of your problems will get worse by becoming a Christian. But I think that's part of the process is genuine growth only happens in that kind of genuine human community. And I think people are just about desperate enough to give it a try at this point.
I think there are a few factors that are converging to exacerbate this problem. One of them is this sense of an inflated reward expectancy. It's so inflated to the point where if we do something once or twice, we then become a guru at it, or we expect a return equivalent to the effort that we put in. But that's been another lesson since turning 20 this year that I look back on, is the fact that the sum of life that we tally together in our head isn't equal. The amount of effort we put into something isn't equal to the reward we get out of it always. Sometimes we put in little effort and we get way more reward. But sometimes we have to slave away for 10 years until we actually get any praise or any results. And I think, again, that misconception comes partly from social media and seeing other people that put on this front of being a success. And we look at all these overnight successes and we think, why can't that be me? But another thing as well is this more left-brain approach to the world and navigating it. This idea that everything can be calculated. And this goes hand in hand with faith. Faith is, in my eyes at least, by definition, going away from the left-brain approach. You can't have faith using your left brain. You can calculate your way there. You can be almost certain. But by definition, faith is making that leap from a left brain calculated approach to looking at the world and thinking, do you know what? This just about, I have this faith. I have trust. And I think this spills over into all kinds of challenges that you need faith for. Not just faith in God, but faith in your own personal ability. You would say derived from God having trust in you. We don't have faith anymore in any sense. Maybe to put it in a more crudely kind of secular form of the tool of faith. And instead, we calculate the risks, we calculate the reward, and we think, do you know what, this isn't worth it.
Yeah.
When in actual reality, we had no idea.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, a psychologist I quote in my book and have interviewed a couple of times, Ian McGilchrist, is kind of the go-to person on this left-right brain thing, and the fact that we now live in a very left hemispheric world where everything has been looked at in terms of a sort of breaking it down to its logical constituents, looking at everything just as bits of data to be manipulated and kind of put together in ways that suit us.
I feel like we should flesh this out a little bit for anyone that hasn't heard of the left brain and the right brain, what they do.
Yeah. So the left brain, traditionally, you know, these are very broad brushstroke ways of putting it, but very often the left hemisphere of our brain is often associated with the more kind of mathematical, logical approach to life, reason, and sort of putting things together, or actually pulling things apart to kind of get them down to their bare essentials. And so you tend to associate quote unquote left brain people with scientists and engineers and people of that sort who are kind of, you know, doing that kind of very intellectual, rational kind of approach. The right hemisphere of our brain is more associated with aspects of our life that involve art, imagination, intuition. So it's very often the right parts of our brain that light up when we're listening to music or engaging in some imaginative activity, praying maybe, and those sorts of things. Again, this is a very crude distillation of a much bigger thesis, but there's a sense in which a well-functioning brain brings both of those two things together, because we need that rational, intellectual side, and we need that imaginative, holistic, intuitional side to be a well-functioning human being. Now, the contention of Ian McGilchrist, and he wrote an excellent book on this called The Master and His Emissary, is that the right brain is supposed to be the dominant side and just use the left brain as its emissary. So the right brain is the master, the left brain is the emissary, to go and do data collection, to bring it back to the right brain, to fit it into a bigger sense-making sphere of the world. But he says the problem is that relationship has been inverted in the modern world. And we've now prioritized left brain thinking over this sense-making, this holistic sense in which the right brain operates. And in a very scientistic world, dominated by that kind of new atheist mantra of all we need is science and reason to pull things apart, to get them down to their core constituents, and we'll solve all our problems. He says that's the problem in our culture. And we're dominated by this way in which we think we can just jettison art, imagination, religion, and so on for this purely scientific, rationalistic way of approaching the world. And he says the problem is that is, you're on a hiding to nothing. That kind of just creates a very sort of shallow, materialistic kind of culture. And I think we're seeing some of the effects of that. I fundamentally agree with his thesis that we live, since we've moved into this very left brain dominated culture, we see that kind of manifesting in all kinds of problems for people, because we've lost touch with the bigger sense of living in a story, and that we need more than just technology and science to solve our problems. We need a kind of spiritual solutions to these kinds of issues. It's about the way we feed our soul as much as, you know, whether we can build a rocket that gets us to Mars and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's the big picture of the left-right brain hemispheric approach. And coming back to your original question, was it about whether the left brain is kind of causing us problems because of that way of thinking we can get to truth by simply having the right formula?
Yeah, well, I guess the question is, what are the consequences of a left brain dominated culture? I mean, I spoke to Abbot Christopher Jamieson about this in a beautiful Roman Catholic church in the city of London, the only one in the city of London. And he gave me this experiment, I think it was done by Ian McGilchrist. And they got two people who have had, I think one had a malfunctioning right brain, one had a left brain. Maybe it was that they somehow activated the left brain in someone who had had a corpus callosotomy. So the part connecting both sides of their brain was severed. and they somehow stimulated the left brain. They somehow stimulated the right brain. When they stimulated the right brain and they got them to draw a tree, they would draw a really bad picture of an entire tree.
Mm-hmm.
When they got them to draw a picture of the tree with the left brain, they would draw a really good picture of half the tree. So what he says is that in a left brain dominated society, we're seeing all of the truth about half of reality.
Okay, that's a really interesting way of putting it. And I think that's right. And going back to your original point, I think it is partly that left-brained approach to culture where if it doesn't add up X, Y, Z in a mathematical formula, I can't believe in it. That is has stopped traditionally a lot of people from engaging Christianity. Because as you say, faith, we're never going to be ultimately argued by a purely rational intellectual argument into the kingdom of God. As I said earlier, it is a matter of the heart in the end. Now, there's an intellectual component to it. And I think that's the wonderful thing about Christianity. It can feed the left brain person just as much as the right brain person. But it is ultimately about the state of your heart. That's the thing that ultimately is at stake. So, I found in my work in apologetics over nearly 20 years, you could probably there's a sense in which you could always offer an intellectual argument for God. But if someone in the end doesn't want to believe it, they're never going to be, I don't think there's any argument you could give them that could ultimately convince them, but, because they can always reach for another objection. There's always going to be something else. So there's never some sort of foolproof argument that someone has to accept to become a Christian. In the end, the thing that I found that apologetics really did was it removed intellectual roadblocks for people. So imagine there's a road and at the other end of it is Jesus Christ, but someone's being blocked from walking down that road towards Christ. And their problem is the problem of suffering or evil. How can God allow that? Well, maybe I can offer some kind of an intellectual argument that helps to deal with that and remove that roadblock. Well, can I trust the Bible? Isn't it full of errors? Well, maybe I can show you some interesting historical evidence that actually we can fundamentally trust the Bible. So you could remove these roadblocks. But in the end, I don't have an argument that's necessarily going to make you want to walk down the road. Even if the roadblocks have been removed, it's still down to you whether you want what's on offer.
You can't resist.
Well, there's a sense in which you have to want what's on offer. There's something about the heart, the motivation ultimately, that is, so you can do all of the intellectual work, but like you said, it won't get you there. And faith is the bit where you say, I want what's on offer and I'm going to take a risk now and walk towards it, even though I might look stupid, even though I might fall flat on my face, even though I'm not totally intellectually convinced that this is going to hold my weight. I'm going to take a step here and see what happens. That's the faith bit. And it's the stepping out bit. And like it or not, I just think a lot of people really struggle with that bit of it because we are so used to having everything, like you say, put into a kind of an intellectual framework where I have complete control in the end over what I do and don't accept. But faith is ultimately an act of surrender. Not in a bad way, not in an anti-intellectual way. And that's often the mistake people make. I have to surrender my brain. You don't have to surrender your brain, but you do have to surrender something. And that's the bit that is difficult.
We have to surrender that you're not God.
Yeah, ultimately, I had to say it. And I don't want to in any way say this is the way most atheists think, but I have seen enough examples of atheists who I think the ultimate reason they don't believe in God is because they don't want to believe in God. And partly because they don't like the idea of someone who is bigger than them. I mean, I've just met too many examples, I think, of people who are so certain of their own intellectual ability that the idea that they would have to surrender, if you like, that sense of autonomy and my ability to order my world the way I want it to for something else, for another intellect that is even bigger than yours. I think that can be quite a psychological barrier to a lot of people. Thomas Nagel, well-known atheist philosopher. He very candidly said in one of his books, one of the things that troubles me about Christianity is that there are so many intellectual people I respect who believe in it, but I don't want it to be true. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And I just think he's just being honest at that point about some of his personal motivations that probably would stand in the way of. And I've met, in the course of doing these shows and conversations with atheists, I've sometimes got to that point in a conversation where we've gone back and forth on the evidence. And I've eventually said to this atheist, look, what could convince you that God exists? Because you've kind of battered away all of this other evidence. And when I've asked that, they've often said, I'm not really sure. And I've said, well, would the stars lining up saying, hey, it's God, time to believe? And then they'll say, well, it could be advanced alien technology. Okay, if Jesus appeared to you in this room right now and said, follow me, no, that I'd assume I was having some kind of brain malfunction. And at that point, that person is so wedded to their naturalistic way of looking at the world that there is literally, it appears, no evidence that they would be able to filter in any other way than in a purely naturalistic way. So at that point, there's no point trying to give that person more evidence for God. That's not what they're looking for. Something's got to change in their heart at that point if they're going to be open to God. So for me, it's kind of like there's always going to be a limit because of who we are as humans to how much evidence and rationality, how far it'll ultimately take you, because there's something inside us which also needs to be dealt with.
And someone might say, oh, but you're just speaking about some atheists that don't know what they're talking about and aren't renowned. That's Richard Dawkins you're talking about there. But the faith element, it makes complete sense to me. And it's something that I'd say it's one of the biggest things I have grappled with Christianity in the last year, is this idea of faith. And it's terrifying because you do want to have control. And I think you'll find it interesting. I wrote some notes down from one of your chapters after I finished reading it in your book. And here's what I said. Sort of Sunday evening on a rooftop in Denver, Colorado, randomly finishing your book. I said, it's so incredibly ignorant for people to dismiss religions that precede their lives 50-fold and permeate across the world, constantly subject to intense scrutiny by the greatest of minds and adopted by billions, without having even read their texts to see if there is something to it. There are three options as to the reason for their lack of engagement: an unwillingness or fear of living in a God-bound universe, an inability to comprehend the profundity of what God is, or a sense that they have seen through the mass delusion of the population without engaging with a powerful text capable of this mass trickery, or that they just don't want to. If I became wholeheartedly convinced tomorrow that Jesus really did get sent by God to bring salvation, it would be an extreme inconvenience. I would be forced to drop my habits of swearing and crude humor through fear of eternal punishment. I think the majority of people simply block themselves from thinking any further than this trade-off due to fear and inconvenience.
So I think there's probably a lot of truth in that. I think there is that component. Now, if it helps at all, Elliot, what I would say is you can be a Christian who swears, okay? I know lots of Christians who have some salty language.
Yeah.
What I would say is we're all on a journey of sort of becoming more Christ-like. And I think that, yes, our language is an important part of that. But my goodness, if we had to kind of get ourselves all straightened out and so on before we can become a Christian, then no one would pass, no one would make the grade. So I would say, if that's holding you back, don't worry, because you can work on the language thing. That may be the work of a lifetime. But the point is, good news is, the next time you say the F word as a Christian, you can ask for forgiveness. It's great. Okay. But you're also encouraged to pursue that sort of Christ-likeness as well, obviously. But that's a slightly facetious example. Yeah, there are going to be all kinds of other ways in which Christianity will be a challenge and should be a challenge. And that's why I said earlier, becoming a Christian isn't necessarily the end of your problems. It may be the start of some new ones, even as it helps to answer some of the other issues in your life. But I think that's part of what it is to grow, and so we would never do anything if we said, well, I'm not going to do anything that's difficult. No great works of art, no great works of architecture, no great, systems of government or systems of thought would ever have been embarked upon. No great navigations of the world if people thought this is going to be difficult. Anything that's worth pursuing is difficult. And I would say Jesus says in the Gospels, if you're going to follow me, you have to count the cost. You have to absolutely be aware that you are taking up a cross. This is going to be difficult, but he says it's going to be worth it. There's something at the end of that road that all of the troubles we may encounter in this life pale into insignificance compared to the joy that is available. So I would say, for you is you're doing that thing, you're doing that modern thing, you're weighing up, well, what is this going to cost me? Okay. And I would direct you again in the direction of Pascal, who had a wager and said a lot of people in his time were having a similar thing. Is it worth the effort of being a Christian on the basis that might not be true? And he basically said, in the end, you've got to ask yourself, well, am I really doing this on rational grounds? Am I really engaging this question on the basis of, because if there's a chance it's true, then I need to really, this should be the first thing on my list of priorities every morning to kind of get to the bottom of whether this thing is true. And so if you think of yourself as a rational person, you should be doing everything in your power to put yourself in a position where if there's a God there, you're open to that God and you want to pursue that God. The fact that most people don't, his argument has often been kind of cast as this sort of, oh, well, if you are on the balance of probabilities and the reward that is potentially there if there is a God and the reward that isn't there if there's a God, you should on balance go for the God thing. He wasn't really making that argument. He was saying, actually, if we were rational, this would be the way we do. But none of us are rational. Okay, so we don't do the rational thing, which is to look for God. So don't go around, it was a kind of a critique to his rationalistic friends. Don't go around thinking you're this rational person when you're not actually doing the rational thing because you're not actually pursuing in any meaningful way a life with God. But I would say it's worth the gamble in a sense, to use that more traditional way of that Pascal put it. It's kind of like you've got potentially everything to gain and not a lot to lose, as far as I can see, compared to the potential gain there. So I don't know if that helps, but it's like, I would say, yeah, give it a try. Do whatever the next thing is that is worth doing it. If you want to know what's true, it's worth really investigating.
And to hammer this point home, Pascal is not saying just go for heaven, pretend that you like God, because if it's true, then you're going to make it into heaven. It's going to be worth it. You might have sacrificed your life on planet Earth, but you can fool God and you can get into heaven. But the wage is worth it. He's saying that these people don't want to believe. They pretend to be these rational beings. I think it was with his friends in the pub that he would always destroy. He was this great mathematician and he would destroy them in wages and probability. I think he invented some sort of theory of probability.
He's basically behind probability theory. Yeah.
And he says to them, on a probabilistic basis, if you guys were thinking in that way,
you would pursue God.
But they're not.
But they're not.
What is it then that's stopping them?
There's the personal motivations, and it does come back to that. And I think that's the challenge of Christianity in the end. It's not some kind of, you have to get a PhD in all the biblical evidence for God and all of that stuff. Some people do that, and that might be helpful for their journey. But actually, the key thing that most people need to sort out is their personal motivations and whether they genuinely are these quote-unquote non-resist non-believers, if they've really done everything they can do to open themselves up to the possibility of God. And like I say, I think that it's a very difficult thing to do. We're very, our own motivations are very often somewhat hard to get to the bottom of ourselves. But I do genuinely believe at a very simple level that when Jesus says, knock and the door will be opened, ask and you will receive, that he means it. And that the grace of God is partly that Jesus accepts our incredibly limited, finite human attempts to make sense of all of this and says, if you throw yourself on me, I'm going to answer. I will be there. As I say, I don't know how that's worked out for people like Alex. Next time I have a chat with him, I'd love to have that conversation about, well, how far have you gone down that road, Alex? What have you done to sort of really say, I'm here, I'm available, I want to hear back from you, God. But yeah, I'd say you're the only person who knows probably best what the thing is in Elliot Bewick's heart that will be the thing that needs to shift in order for you to be open to that possibility.
Well, I think the most interesting thing since starting to engage with all of these concepts and conversations is that I've had a flip. I think initially it was in my heart, if we want to call it that I had my objections. I wanted to be in control of my own life. I didn't want a God that had given me purpose. I want to control my own destiny. Classic Gen Z male style, right? I'm a hardworking guy and I can conquer the world if I try hard enough. And now I've gone through a substantial amount of arguments for God's existence and against. And it's like, yeah, but if God doesn't exist, you have no free will and you have no choice in what you do anyway. Stack that on top of a million other things and God's omnibenevolence. I think my heart does really want God to exist now. And actually, it's the intellectual side that is lacking. My left brain tells me that I completely get this concept of faith and making that leap. But it's a risky play because I don't currently see enough evidence historically, whatever it may be, that proves that this is something that warrants faith. So I don't want to leave myself susceptible to being tricked into some form of mass delusion. Now, I know you'll have a lot to say on that, but that's where I'm at the moment. It's actually flipped from wanting to play God to hoping that there is a God, but being worried that there's not and that I'm going to be tricked.
Okay, that's really interesting. So if I could ask one or two follow-up questions on that. What, I suppose, well, firstly, have you read the Gospels?
I have read some of them and I've watched a lot of podcasts about them, but that's as far as it goes.
Well, I would say the first thing to do is just to read the source material.
Yeah.
Okay. Read the Gospels, read the New Testament. If you get time, absolutely dip into the Old Testament as well. You're going to find there, if you like, the accounts that were written down by the earliest followers of Jesus. And yeah, there's lots of sort of question marks over sort of aspects of the historicity of that and how they were transmitted and all of that kind of thing. But I've come to the settled conclusion, having, hosted a lot of conversations with people on both sides of that these are fundamentally trustworthy accounts of the life and death of Jesus. Now, it also includes miraculous claims, most importantly, the claim that Jesus himself rose from the dead. And so I can totally understand that your left brain is like, okay, that's a big claim. How if that's true, it changes everything. But how can I know, And I would just say, I think there's enough evidence there from the historical sort of sources of the Gospels and surrounding them, and the things that happened around those set of events. Things like the discovery of an empty tomb by his female followers, the way in which it changed the lives, of skeptics, the way in which the early church blossomed and grew exponentially at this point. There's all kinds of like pieces of data that for me are confirmatory of this claim that was made at the time that Jesus rose from the dead. And as I say, you're never going to get to some, I don't know, arbitrary, like 99% like proof of this on, but you might find it's more than 50%. This was what happened with someone I got to know recently, Molly Worthen, who had spent most of her life as a kind of interested agnostic when it came to Christianity. She's a professor of religion, interestingly, at the University of North Carolina. And she sort of wrote articles for mainstream media and so on about religion in North America, but had always kind of basically been on the fence as regards whether Christianity was true or not, until a pastor she did an interview with sort of challenged her to do some homework and said, look, go and read N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which really delves into this whole question of, is there historical evidence for the resurrection? Go and talk to some apologists like Tim Keller, who was alive at the time. And she started having these conversations with these scholars. And she says, to her own great surprise, she found there was a lot more historical, credible evidence than she had realized. But she says she never got to a point of like overwhelming evidence that kind of forced her to believe. But she said, I got to a point where like there was enough. It changed. There was enough to make me really take this seriously. And what I found though was that I was sort of in a kind of materialistic groove, and that it was kind of getting bounced out of that. That was the thing that helped me. So the faith part, if you like, was saying, okay, the intellectual side of me, you know, there's enough there for me to take this seriously. Can I escape this kind of materialist sort of mindset that just refuses at one level to countenance the possibility of the miraculous? And once she'd kind of found a way of sort of saying, I'm going to suspend my disbelief, if you like, and kind of allow myself to take this seriously, she suddenly found lots of things started falling into place for her, and that it met her sort of in all kinds of emotional and spiritual ways. But like her, I don't think you're ever going to kind of find like there's this sort of 99% sort of probability that it stacks up to.
Yeah.
It's always going to be open to the possibility that you could be wrong. But I still think there's enough there to make a rational decision to go for it. Because you have to do that in life generally. There's all kinds of things where you cannot have absolute certainty of, but you just have to go on the basis that this will probably work. You know, when you sat down on that chair, there was no absolute 100% proof that it wouldn't collapse under you the moment you sat on it. But your general experience of chairs and so on suggests that this is going to be fine. So you're always committing yourself at one level to a greater or lesser extent to things. And I just think it's the same with Christian faith. You're never going to arrive at some sort of 100% certainty, but I think there's enough there on the sort of intellectual historical side that when you match it with what you appear to be going through, Elliot, which is this sense that I want more, I need there to be more at this point. I think it's worth staking something like that. I think it's worth a gamble, if you will, of saying, I'm going to try this, going to give this a go.
The problem I have is that I'm sure it is worth the gamble. But that might reveal something about our human condition, that we just are built for delusions that aren't historically true necessarily, but that allow us to flourish. And I don't know, maybe that's a stupid sort of rebuttal, but the idea of truth is important, right? So even if this helps me flourish, and accepting and making that leap brings me closer to God or a perceived God, and it works great in my life, there might be something deeper that's faulty with this made-up religion. It might have nailed the human condition, that we need these delusions, but it might not be perfect because it's not true. And if that's the case, what happens downstream from accepting that as a framework for life when there are potential gaps that may open up? Now, what you may argue is that the gaps that are opened up in a secular world are even larger.
Yeah, well, that is a useful thing to do. It's like, because the reality is, if you decide not to become a Christian, you're still making a choice to be something else. And you're essentially, I think, making a choice to be a sort of maybe agnostic as regards God, but you're kind of stepping into another world view, which is something along the lines of, we live in an essentially material world where there is no ultimate overarching meaning or purpose to things. It's a kind of dog eat dog, survival of the fittest, whatever kind of approach to life. Or some other philosophy, there's going to be something. And as you say, there's going to be all kinds of questions raised by that. Perhaps, when the atheist says, oh, you're just a Christian because of your background and upbringing, I could equally turn that around and say, well, maybe you're an atheist because of your background and upbringing. It cuts both ways. There's always going to be questions that are going to be there in the background about whether we've chosen our belief system for the right or wrong reasons, whether we're being self-delusional or so on. In the end, I think if you let those potential concerns stop you from ever taking the step, I think that's a mistake. I think it's you sort of, again, it's the faith thing, isn't it? It's like you're saying, I could be wrong about this. There might be something that turns up later, which makes me, in which I become convinced that it was all just a mass delusion, some kind of useful fiction or whatever. But at this point, if you don't have overwhelming reasons to think that that is the case at this point, I think you're perfectly justified to try and see, because again, one of the problems is that you can spend a long time poking around at Christianity from the outside, but it's only really once you step in that you're necessarily going to really get it. And this is just true of so many things in life. It's like, I remember when my dad decided to take up sailing a dinghy when I was young, as a teenager, and he'd done it as a kid, so he thought, I remember basically how to do it. But he got a manual and he taught himself all the ropes and the everything. But of course, the first time we actually got on the water and tried it for real, it was a complete disaster, because like there's a very big difference between doing the thing and sort of learning about it in theory. And I feel it's the same with Christianity. Like, you can poke around it from the outside for a long time, trying to get all of your questions answered. But until you actually take that step and step into this worldview and look at it from the inside, you're not really going to fully understand what it is. So I think you just have to sometimes. It is that surrender thing again. Accept that I'm never going to know that I could be proven wrong here. I could later on down the line discover that this was just a useful fiction or something, a mass delusion. But unless I take a step now, I'll just be putting it off forever for any number of possible intellectual hurdles. When what I really need to do is do the experiment, find out if this thing actually supports my way when I actually step into it.
Well, I guess what you could say to the atheist is, are you afraid of engaging with this scripture because you don't have enough self-belief that you would be able to just get rid of this delusion? You think that it'll overwhelm you, that you'll be tricked into it? Did you really have that low of a self-belief? But I guess I would say, like, yeah, maybe it is the case that Christianity exposes some sort of kind of glitch in our human system, and that you would be overruled by the amazing stories, even if they're not true. But then from that, you get the problem that goes back even further. You're kind of just kicking the can down the alley because you haven't even engaged with any of the science of how the world was created. And this is what really struck me in your book in the closing chapters, was the discussion of the fine-tuning argument and all of these other arguments for the existence of God. They're just impossible to deal with as an agnostic or as an atheist, certainly. And I think that's something that I need to delve into a lot more, because I have a feeling that I'll come to some pretty Christian conclusions from that, because otherwise it's inexplicable. And I feel like the stance that someone like a Dawkins takes on that is way more religious than that of Christians.
Yeah. Well, again, for me, those are really interesting areas. And again, they're part of the reason why I think there is a good intellectual case to be made for God, on that purely on the basis of what it took for humans to be here. It seems to fit better with the story that there's a mind behind the universe than that we are here by chance, that there's no ultimate purpose or kind of guiding hand, to any of it. Just on a purely sort of scientific, rational level, that doesn't look like the way things are stacking up, given what we know about the fine-tuning of the universe, Big Bang cosmology, the origin of life. It, again, is one of these curious things that just doesn't seem to be susceptible to a naturalistic sort of bottom-up approach to kind of explaining everything. Now, again, what I will say is, having gone over the arguments for these on many debates between Christians and atheists, there are, of course, always going to be ways you can push back on that. It's not that any of this forces you to believe in God, okay? But I do think that there's certainly enough reasons pointing in the general direction of God. And I would say this is a cumulative thing. It's not just one argument that does this for me. It's like when I put that argument alongside the case for Jesus, alongside the moral argument, alongside all kinds of other arguments, I think there's a general, it all kind of, for me, feels quite compelling at an intellectual level. But again, it's like, as I said earlier, if you're looking for 100% certainty, you're not going to find it. There's always going to be a way of pushing back on any one of those arguments and people who disagree and so on. And I wonder whether in a way that's kind of God's done that on purpose, because I don't think what God's looking for is people who believe in him just because they got convinced by an intellectual argument.
Yeah.
I think God's looking for people who trust in him.
Yeah.
And that's a bit different to just sort of saying, yeah, sign me up. I'll sign on the dotted line now that you've kind of met these intellectual criteria on my list. I think God in his grace gives us enough intellectual reasons to take him seriously, but he'll never force us to believe in him. I think there's something extra that God's looking for, which is faith.
Yeah, well, I guess it opens up the question of free will, and if you would be able to choose to believe in God, if you could be an atheist that then gets given enough proof such that believing in God is the necessary conclusion, then you'd be able to just be an atheist that doesn't have any faith, any trust in God, and you wouldn't really be deciding to believe in him. It would just be shown to you.
Yeah, it'd be like one more kind of logical conclusion that it's there's a famous verse in the book of James in the Bible where it says, even the demons believe and tremble. There's a sense in which belief isn't the thing, it's what do you do with that belief? Just kind of intellectual assent to the idea that God exists is kind of neither here nor there in the big scheme of things. That can be a good thing or a bad thing. The question is, what do you do with that? And if you do come to the belief that God has been made known in Jesus Christ, I think there are plenty of people who deep down have come to that conclusion, but don't like that. And they've sort of said, I'm not in. I don't like that. So I'm going to kind of, it just comes back to the heart. There's a kind of sense in which, in the end, it's about what you do with the God that is there. And I think the great danger, again, this has been my experience in hosting apologetics debates, is that it turns into a game of kind of pushing counters around a board, kind of intellectual arguments.
Yeah.
But if that's all it is, it's a sort of pointless exercise. Whereas if God, the question is, if there is a God, what does that mean for my life now? It's got to mean something much bigger than just an interesting intellectual exercise. And for me, that's where the fun begins, actually. It's not about, arguments for and against God are interesting intellectually, but if you stop there, you're missing the whole point of the thing.
This is another one for the left brainers like myself out there. C.S. Lewis says, supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind, in that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen for physical or chemical reasons to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me, as a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way the splash arranges itself will give you a map of London.
It's a great quote. So this is an interesting one. And years ago, I sort of debated this a bit with Alex O'Connor on his show.
All roads lead to Alex O'Connor.
Absolutely, of course. But partly because, Alex has, and as far as I'm aware, hasn't changed his mind yet on this, is essentially a determinist. And it's an intriguing philosophical worldview, because as that quote from Lewis suggests, it has some consequences. And if it is true that all of our thoughts are essentially the end product of a non-rational, let's call it, process of the inexorable workings of the physics of the universe over millennia, to the point where it's produced a set of physical outcomes in you and me and in our brains. And the way that's ended up fizzing, the brain chemistry, has given me a belief in Christianity and has given you a belief in atheism or agnosticism or whatever, then actually reason and evidence don't really come into it. That all it is a physical process. That's what determinism says. Given the conditions that already existed in the universe, you could not be thinking anything different to what you think right now. I could not be thinking anything different to just as we couldn't have chosen anything different for breakfast or whatever. It was all determined by physical constraints of the universe. Now, if that's true, it seems to me to radically undercut anybody who claims that they've become an atheist or become a Christian for evidential reasons, that there wasn't enough evidence, because ultimately it wasn't because of any reasoning process that we had some control over. We don't have control over anything. That's the whole point of determinism. You have no control over anything. The universe gave you the conditions you live in, the things you do, and the thoughts that you're thinking. You didn't have any control over it. There's no free will. So I've always felt that free will, if you say that doesn't exist, you're giving up an awful lot in the process. I mean, people very commonly talk about the fact that blame and desert go with free will. You know, we can't blame people for their bad actions. We can't praise people for their good actions. It was just the way things were always going to be. Okay, so that's one problem. Morality kind of it's very hard to have any kind of sense of a foundation for morality. But I think it's much worse, far worse for the atheist when it comes to reason, because at least on that, most atheists hold out, well, look, maybe I'm going to bite the bullet and say, I don't believe in free will. And yes, morality is a completely kind of subjective thing that is purely a result of, a deterministic process. But at least I've got my reason, and logic. But reason and logic don't exist either in any meaningful sense on a deterministic worldview. All you've got is the collision of atoms and chemistry. That's all that ultimately exists. There's no right or wrong about the way atoms collide and the effects they produce. And that's why Lewis says, I might as well hope that this spilling a milk jug produces a map of it's like, you've got no guarantor. There's no guarantee of anything being the result of some deductive process of reasoning, because that's no longer available to you if it's ultimately just this process. So I've always found this a really fascinating argument against atheism, and in my view, it lends some reason to why it makes sense to believe in God. If there is a God, then there is at least one agent that exists outside of this deterministic process, and an agent that could guarantee freedom, free will, and therefore it kind of rescues the idea of reason and logic and that kind of thing. So for me, it's this would be a whole podcast to flesh out, but I find it a fascinating argument. It's quite a hard one sometimes to get your head around, but for me, it's one of those arguments where the very thing the atheist is hoping to hold on to, reason, because they also believe in determinism, they undercut that very idea of reason in the process.
And to steelman this a bit further, I can see a world where even if that is the case, you do still have laws like gravity, because if gravity didn't act the way it does now, our world would have imploded and we wouldn't have existed. So necessarily gravity has to act the way it does, and there are certain laws that form around that. But nothing in that says that humans have to be rational to exist. There's nothing in that at all.
No. I mean, another philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, sort of took this up to the level of evolution and said basically, if you're a thoroughgoing atheist and you believe in a kind of purposeless process of evolution, what you believe in is a process that essentially selects for survival, and but it doesn't select for truth. It doesn't select for reason. So if our brains are the process of the end product of a process that essentially is selecting for survival, it completely undercuts this idea that I am a rational, person who is always aimed towards truth. No, you're aimed towards survival, and that could mean that there's all kinds of false beliefs that aid your survival, but which you pick up along the way because that's the way. So again, people like Alvin Plantinga have taken Lewis's argument and applied it in different places, like the theory of evolution, to say it's not that he was against evolution. He was just saying you can only depend on your reasoning faculties if there's something outside of this process that gives you good reason to believe that you do have good reasons to believe that your thoughts are generally true and reliable and so on, because evolution isn't the mechanism that will do that for you. It's not intended to. So there's all kinds of things, as you say, which militate against the idea that us humans are somehow intrinsically going to be pointing towards truth. But as I say, I think the deterministic thing is even worse for that than the kind of Alvin Plantinga's issue with naturalistic evolution. I think it completely undercuts any sense that we have any kind of any reasoning is going on at all. There isn't. There's just a physical process occurring that ends up in some people believing some things and others other things, but not because of some truth that exists out there. It's just a physical process. So that's the really key thing. I mean, even the law of gravity. It's like, yeah, there is a law of gravity. We believe in a law of gravity, and in a sense, it exists, but the way we conceive of that is, again, purely mediated by a process of thought and perception that is ultimately very hard to say what it is we believe in if it's all a deterministic thing. It's because all of these things ultimately have to be filtered through some sense that we're using rationality and reason to come to considered conclusions about this law of gravity and everything else. It feels like if you haven't got that anchored, it's very hard to say that anything else really exists in any real sense, because it exists insofar as you seem to have access to it through your senses. But if you can't trust those senses, where does that leave you? It's a sort of determinism has this sort of corrosive aspect, I find, on everything. It leaves nothing untouched, because it starts to make you question whether there's any sort of reason to believe in anything if everything that we're being delivered is completely outside of our control in that sense.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I want us to end on this. What would your advice be to someone who's in Gen Z, who's struggling to get out of bed in the morning? Their life has no meaning. It has no purpose. They're in the prime of their lives, yet they feel no desire whatsoever to do anything.
Firstly, get off your phone and pick up a Bible. And quite a lot of Gen Z, interestingly, are doing that at the moment. Read about Jesus. Try praying. Try turning up at a church. See what happens. I'm not saying this will be some magical cure for that nihilism, that depression, whatever it is that exists. But in my experience, what Jesus offers is the answer to all the things that we are ultimately looking for in our life. So my best advice is to look for Jesus. And one of the best ways to do that is to stop looking at everything else that's demanding our attention in this world, and go back to the source. So read who he was in the Gospels. Try reaching out to see if he might be there. Try going along somewhere where other people claim to have met him, and see what happens.
Justin Brierley, thanks for coming on the show. Where can people find more of your work?
JustinBrierley.com is a good place to go. You can find the books. You can find my podcast as well, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And
there they are.
Yeah, there they are. So yeah, thanks for the conversation, Elliot. It's been really fun.
Yeah, we'll need to do another podcast about free will and
absolutely
everything else. There's just so much to cover with you. You're such a wealth of knowledge. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Very kind. Thank you.